Hi, I'm Robert Lang, Director of Brookings Mountain West, and tonight we finally got the PowerPoint going. We're happy with that. We're going to see a talk on innovation, inequality, and commercialization of research, a critical topic for this state that's seeking to diversify its economy. There it goes. It's glad to see that up there. After, yeah, applause, please, all around. The speaker is Walter Valdivia. Is that right?
Perfectly
yes?
so.
All right, there you go. I have a problem with phonetics. And I'm working on it, though. It's a lifelong project. And Walter is going to speak on a topic, again, that's of interest certainly to this state and region, because we have not been in the forefront of the translation of the innovation economy that's developed in the universities and into the private sector, and around the nation, places like Utah, for example, of which we have hoped to emulate in a recent policy shift where the state is going to make some of these investments, and hopefully a lot of that will be in Las Vegas. That is a positive development, and the research you'll hear tonight is on the efforts to commercialize this same capacity around U.S. I want to make an announcement too that the next talk, which is a week from now, correct? Am I crazy in that? Is Alex out there somewhere? I don't see a date. I'm assuming it's a week from today. It better be, yeah, because people will show up. Overcoming legislative gridlock in the U.S. Congress. Is that happening there? I had not heard about that. Yes, they relitigate 2010 legislation continuously. How procedural rules affect legislative obstructionism by Molly Jackman in Governance Studies. You're in Governance Studies as well. This is all Governance Studies, and you were at the University of California, Berkeley before. Yes. Brookings, you've been at Brookings a year, and your doctorate is from Arizona State University, a school that is very serious about the commercialization of research that comes out of the university, correct? Yes, indeed. And Michael Crow, the president of ASU, is a leader U.S. In that effort. So it's all yours. Thanks.
Thank you, Rob, for that kind introduction. As Rob was saying, we were seemingly having problems with the PowerPoint presentation. As you see, I am at the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. The center, of course, as its name suggests, primarily researches the social dimensions, economic dimensions of technology. So there is no way that we can start a conversation about technology without having a glitch, a technological glitch. So it has been staged. It was part of the presentation. I am very pleased to be back in the Southwest. As Rob mentioned, I graduated from Arizona State. I spent 7 years there, and you would be surprised how much one gets to miss the Sonoran Desert in despite of its temperatures during the summer. So over the last few days, I have been speaking with a number of people here at the university, all sharing a common concern: how to increase the economic impact of the University of Las Vegas, Nevada, on the state economy. And this is a very important concern, of course, that is shared across the nation by universities. There is not only the motivation of universities and the own history of the university system in the U.S. that has had a important participation in the development of regions, but there is increasing political pressure for universities to show the returns on the federal investments on their research capacity and education efforts. Universities have 2 essential functions, and a third or fourth are currently being debated. The traditional essential functions of universities are research and education. And these 2 are central to the impact of universities on the innovation system. So universities inject a particular dynamism in the innovation system, and therefore it is very important when we talk about innovation to examine the role of the universities. I'm giving you a preface because I intend to speak of something that is a very particular process within the innovation system, that the term of art is technology transfer. And technology transfer is one of the most important functions of the university when you think of the impact that they can make on innovation and in general the economy. Now there is a lot, a veritable library written about university technology transfer, and I like to add to this conversation with my research a particular angle, the effect of technology transfer from the university on the innovation system, on the distributional outcomes of the innovation system. So you have heard probably, if you watch the news, if you read the press, if you read economic analysis, if you read The Economist, that innovation is key for economic growth, for job creation. That's absolutely true. What is not discussed a lot is that at the same time that you promote economic growth and you promote job creation, you are also promoting a particular distribution of those benefits coming from innovation. And at the same time, distribution happens by the markets, by the effect of the market system, at the same time that economic growth happens. So it is important to look at this other side of the same equation that we have been speaking when we are speaking of innovation. And I will focus again on the role of the university and technology transfer and the policies that govern technology transfer in the US. The plan of my talk is giving you first an overview of the relationship of innovation and inequality, bringing to bear some of the current debates. Then I will describe the regime. I call it BDR because it's an acronym for the Bayh-Dole regime that governs technology transfer at the university. I'll explain you what is the Bayh-Dole Act. I'll explain you what was the other set of policies introduced in the 80s and 90s. And then I will go on to describing how is this regime helping to reduce, to mitigate, or to exacerbate inequalities resulting from the innovation process. And I will end with a few policy recommendations that emerge from this analysis. I hope nobody tweets like that they did to Marco Rubio's sip of water during his response to the presidential address. Look at the first graph above. I'm borrowing this from the MIT Technology Review, just because it succinctly explains many of the things that, of the overview I want to give you. You see in the black line in the first graph a continuous growth. That is the growth of productivity since 1943. Economists have found and demonstrated that the long-term productivity gains are due to innovation. Very well. It's interesting that a couple of researchers from MIT observed that at some point employment, now I'm talking about the gray line below, marked by that breach in white, started lagging behind, losing ground at around 2000. So one thing is confirmed, long-term productivity growth in the economy, but then we have a slowdown of employment growth. And this is Andrew McAfee and his co-author, who proposed that the revolution introduced by information and communication technologies, that I may choose to call them the internet in short. The effects of internet have been excellent for productivity gains, but have displaced some of the works. Robotization has displaced some of the work. Automatization has displaced some of the job. And while productivity continues to grow, by effect of innovation, employment is not, which is somewhat troublesome if that trend were to perpetuate itself. Now I want to drive your attention to this other graph, where you see a difference. Again, in black is GDP per capita, and in gray, the line below, is household income. Now you see how, while GDP keeps growing, household income in the US has remained somewhat stable. They explain again that this is a result of the introduction of innovation and the displacement of high-paying jobs in the manufacturing sector by the introduction of automatization in the productive sector. Now consider this pie. About 80% of the economy is in services. I would imagine that here in Las Vegas you can relate closely to this graph. A significant part of the economy of Las Vegas is in the hospitality and gaming industry, which is considered services. You get a sense, of course, by being residents of Las Vegas, of how much automatization has influenced the service sector. And the question is, remains open, I would say, whether McAfee and his co-author are right that the introduction of automatization and information and communication technologies have displaced jobs and have stagnated wages because of that structure of the economy. So there is the long secular trend of productivity gains, and then there is, in the short term, identify some fluctuation in the labor and wage conditions because of these disruptive technologies that could be ascribed to automatization and particularly the internet. So David Atkinson is a proponent of emphasizing the long-term productivity gains of innovation. And with long-term productivity gains, he also observes the real wage has increased at the same pace, and that we should look at that, and therefore Atkinson is somewhat skeptical of the work of McAfee and his co-author from MIT, and everybody who may suggest increases in inequality by the effect of innovation. Well, as I had explained just now, the argument is that a disruptive technology phases out certain type of employment that is not adept to the use of this technology. In this case, automatization of the productive processes will displace low-skill labor. That is known in economics as the skill-biased technical change hypothesis. That is to say that technical change favors skills or labor with high skills, and therefore labor that does not keep up with the technological change will not have access to employment. The jobs will not be there, or the jobs will be paid less. Now, it is interesting when they engage in this debate, and there was a recent forum on September 10 on this point, because one could say that in the long run, they may be arguing the same point, only that skill-biased technical change, or whoever suggests that technology creates a disruption in the economic system that creates unemployment or a stagnation of wages is temporary during the transition, and that in the long term, real wages go back to adjusting to productivity growth. So you can have disruptions with temporary increases in inequality in the short run, but then you could have increasing equality and a growth rate of real wages at the same pace as innovation in the long run. I want to introduce two concepts that will help you make or understand the point I'm going to make about the consequences and effects of the technology transfer regime. The first is borrowed from this very controversial author, which is Karl Polanyi. Is that book, Karl Polanyi, The Great Transformation. He introduced the concept of forms of economic integration. He suggested that the introduction of a regulated free market system or a self-regulated free market system in England was not simply a transformation of the way the production was organized, but it was a complete thorough transformation of the social system, even the way people do their calculations in their personal decisions. An important aspect that I want to capture beyond the controversy that the history of Karl Polanyi may have ignited among scholars is that the concept itself of forms of economic integration, the concept that you cannot decouple economic transformation from social transformation, that they become integrated, is what I want to capture. And why? Because I want to use one aspect of that, not decoupling the phenomena, the processes, when I speak of innovation. I call it modes of innovation. The quality of seeing a particular organization of innovation in a region or a nation that has characteristics across, among other things, distribution. What I'm trying to suggest by modes of innovation is that innovation is not a unique phenomenon by which the markets absorb new technology into their productive capacity and then just adjust wages and prices accordingly. But that particular forms of innovation will have different paces of growth and different rates or different patterns of economic distribution. In other words, innovation is not a single phenomena, but several phenomena that to some extent is subject to design. So you can have one mode of innovation that promotes fast growth and high inequality, or you can have another mode of innovation that promotes fast growth and low inequality. And that these different modes of innovation are to some extent susceptible to be influenced and shaped by policy. I'm introducing this again as a general concept that then later I will explain with much more precision from the perspective of the regime of technology transfer. And the last concept that I wanted to introduce is borrowed from Joseph Schumpeter. It's called creative destruction. The basic proposition of creative destruction is that this driver of long-term progress, innovation, doesn't exist free of trouble, if you want. When a new cohort of firms adopt the new technology and become more efficient, they will destroy in the market competition the competition. So there has to be a sector that has not been able to adopt the new technologies, which starts losing ground in the market and eventually will go bankrupt, and all the jobs supported by that sector, the sector that is being phased out by the new technology, are lost. All that equipment becomes useless or obsolete, and eventually the old sector is phased out and the new sector emerges. Now, in the short run, effectively, this creative destruction could have effects on wages and inequality. But Schumpeter said in the long run, this process of innovation having a creative power that ultimately, when the destructed sector is completely phased out, it's a boon for the economy. So the basic notion of creative destruction would, in one sense, help explain the debate that we have been, that I have been discussing, the contemporary debate as to whether innovation creates inequality or not, in the sense that yes, it may create a serious disruption in the short term, and we may be seeing the effects of high inequality driven by innovation, but then in the long run, at least the expectation or the hope is that innovation will drive a growth in real wages that is commensurate to the growth in productivity gains. There's another interesting aspect of creative destruction, which is if a new cohort of firms emerges in the economy to phase out the old cohort, the control of productive assets also changes hands. Creative destruction is not only an economic phenomenon, but it may also be a political phenomenon of change. If the control of the means of production, of the assets, of the productive assets, is, if you want, indicative of relative political power. So, a new emerging sector that has accrued enough power will start becoming increasingly influential. And you can start seeing hints of this process when you see that the internet companies that 15 years ago were not even heard of now have an increasing influence on policymaking, at least in the domain, in policy of the domain in which they operate. Think of Google, for instance, or think of Facebook, Twitter. With those concepts in mind, let me move now more precisely to the Bayh-Dole regime. So what is Bayh-Dole? Before the act was passed in 1980, there were in total 26 different policies by federal agencies on how to govern patenting by contractors of the federal government. Because this is a general audience, for those who are experts in the area, I'll ask you to bear with me as I explain the very basic elements of this equation. The very basic elements are simple to understand. Any contractor from the government who does research may come up with a discovery that is patentable, and they may take a patent on it. Now the question is, if the government was funding the research, who owns the patent? Before 1980, the question was not answered in a unified way. Each agency would decide how to assign the patent. So the general presumption was that if the government paid for the research, it should be the government who owns the patent. Seemed at the time fairly reasonable. However, particularly in biomedical research, they discovered that because the monopoly granted to firms by the patent was so important to private companies developing new drugs, they would not venture into developing and incurring the very expensive costs of developing a new drug, if they did not have full control of the patent. It was too risky for them, and remains being too risky for drug companies, to make the investments without having full control and the monopoly of the patent. Now this is interesting because what companies said is, if you want this research to be developed in products, you need to grant clearly, you need to assign to the government, you need to assign the property rights very clearly. Now, if the patents are under the name of the government has at any moment's notice, the right to execute a patent in the best, in the interest of the public. So, in the firms would fear that in the midst of the expensive process of getting through drug approval, the government would see that this drug was important for a certain public health concern, and then intervene and open the patent for a non-exclusive use of other drug developers. So the bargain was for the government to declare clearly a assignee of the title to the patent, so that the firms could then negotiate with that assignee whatever private terms to exploit the patent, but including in these terms could be the exclusivity of patent ownership. So what the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980 did was transfer these rights to nonprofits, small businesses, and the universities. From the Bayh-Dole on, the university receives research money from the federal government, and whatever comes out of that research in terms of patentable discoveries, those are, or the university by law is entitled to take a title to it. The university may choose not to take title if it doesn't see that it's profitable to invest. It's about $20,000 to $30,000 per patent. But now, by effect of the act, the university is entitled to those patents. And once the university has taken title on a patent, now it's an independent from the government entity that can negotiate with industry, right? So universities that come up with patents relevant for the development of drugs now can negotiate with the pharmaceutical companies the terms of licensing, and the pharmaceutical companies, while paying a fee to the university, will keep a monopoly as they need it to develop further. So the inspiration of the act was, we need to establish clearly property rights in order to create a market for those patents, so that companies can develop these patents and commercialize these patents, right? we are seeing a transfer of property rights from what originally was presumed to be government property, patents developed with federal money, to the private sector. The purpose of the act, and here's the key element of it, is that that research paid for by tax dollars of all citizens of the US, that research doesn't remain in shelves accumulating dust, that research is transferred to the productive sector that will exploit those patents in a commercial way. That is the key and basic logic of Bayh-Dole. So before, as I was saying, it was to the discretion of the federal agency to decide whether to assign the titles to the contractors, whether it's this universities or laboratories, or to keep rights on these patents. After the Bayh-Dole Act, there's a unified rule, which is the contractor, in this case the university, takes or is allowed to take title on the patents, right? The main beneficiaries of Bayh-Dole have been unquestionably the universities, because now universities receive, on one hand, federal monies for research. If something of this is patentable that has a commercial value, then the university will start cashing on the licenses of those patents. Think of a license of a patent as renting your property, right? Signing a lease contract. You own a piece of land or you own a condo, you put it up for rent so somebody can come to use it, and you receive a monthly rent. Something like that works for patents, right? There's a patent owned by the university. To use that patent, the company will pay a licensing fee. The licensing fee then becomes income for the university. So universities have the discretion to decide how to use those funds. It's a traditional rule that 30% or 1/3 goes to the faculty member that has come up with the discovery, 30% to his department, and 30% to discretionary funds of the university. But again, universities have a discretion to split this. And in the case of, for instance, UNLV, I learned that the split is 60% to the inventor, 60% to the faculty that come. Or in any one case, it could be a student who comes up with a patent. And this has been, at least in some fields, the case for some patents. Okay, so we know now what is the Bayh-Dole Act and how we changed the rules. Look in pink, the trend of US patents. This is in double scale because, of course, the university patenting is not commensurate to the same level of patenting in the US. So read the scale for the university patenting is on the right and the scale for US patenting is on the left. But what this graph helps you compare is the trend, right? There is, since 1980, a growing trend of patenting in the US, but also an exponential growth of patenting in the university. So proponents of Bayh-Dole say, look how well the act did. This policy really triggers so much patenting on the side of universities. Look, evidently in the data, it seems that that's the case. What is interesting is that in this section, before the act was passed, you cannot see it because of the scale, but what I detected was an exponential growth of patenting by universities. Before the Bayh-Dole Act was enacted, there was already a fast-paced growth of patenting at the universities. So what I did was a simple exercise of statistics. If we were sitting right now in 1979, and we only have this information, we would like to forecast the patenting of universities going forward. What would be the best curve to adjust for that growth? So if you have taken classes in statistics, you know that you adjust by the functional form of the trend. And in this case, it was an exponential growth. So I transfer, this is now in a logarithmic scale, right? So what is an exponential in this scale has to be a linear. And if you are here, as I was saying, 1979, your history of university patenting is giving you an exponential trend, in fact. So again, we're in 1979, and we decide to forecast how it's going to university patent growth. if we use only history, only the time series of patenting, what we find is quite a good forecast. Look all the way to the year 2000. We have almost a perfect forecast for patenting. This suggests an important aspect of university patenting. It was already on the rise at an exponential scale, right? Now, it is true that without the changes in the law, the policy changes that happened starting with Bayh-Dole, and that same year was another important change relevant for federal laboratories. This fast growth of university patent would not have been possible. That's true. But this chart and this estimation helps us understand a key aspect of it. University patent was already growing, and there was high pressure at many universities for increase the patenting. So this is what I call the Bayh-Dole regime, a set of laws that passed after Bayh-Dole. Well, in the case of Stevenson Wilder, it was right before, but it was the same year, that have reshaped patenting, and particularly university patent in the US. So it was not Bayh-Dole alone. It was a set of policies, a complex set of policies and court decisions, Supreme Court decisions. Just to give you an example, how things changed in 1980 with the Diamond versus Chakrabarty decision. That decision by the Supreme Court allowed the patenting of a living organism. So that kind of decision expanded patentable matter. In 1982, you will see the creation of the Court of Appeals of the Federal District as the third item. It centralized appeals of patent courts. It created a more systematic decision-making at the court level, at the appeals court level. And what is interesting is that because it was manned with judges that in the past had been patent attorneys, there was, of course, and there are studies showing that a clear bias in favor of stronger patent protection starting in 1982 by effect of this. So what we have is greater protection of patenting and an expansion of patentable matter supporting university patenting. To this, we have other effects that are very interesting. For instance, and very important to this change. As I was saying, in 1980, patentable matter started to include certain living organisms. And this was the result, this was a time in which molecular biology was coming to maturity in what we have come to know as bioengineering. So the manipulation of the genetic code to design specific functions or shut down specific functions of living organisms came to maturity, and this expanded the things that could be patented. And with the Supreme Court decision and these laws, so the patentable matter was expanded. So the university was starting to produce many more things that are patentable, and the laws allowed for more patenting to exist and greater protection on patenting. That's what I call the Bayh-Dole regime, rejecting the hypothesis that Bayh-Dole alone did it, but that it was a package of laws that transformed the way patenting was in the US, and particularly university patenting. So the major effects, as discussed by scholars and policy analysts of the Bayh-Dole regime, is the unintended effect on quality of patents. There was a concern that by universities trying to capture the rents from licensing, they would quickly and fast move into patenting anything, regardless of the quality. There is an ongoing debate as to whether the quality of patents, however the number had been exponentially growing, the quality was not keeping up with that kind of exponential growth. But there has been some research localized in some universities showing that actually universities learn to patent and the quality has not been in decline. There is a general concern about the crowding out of basic research, that the motivation of scientists to pursue profit from their activities led them to redirect the research agendas to apply research instead of basic research. things that are closer to patenting than things that are merely theoretical constructs. There was a concern that what legal scholars, Haler and Rebecca Henderson, call the tragedy of the anti-commons. There's a lot to discuss about the tragedy of the anti-commons, but I can summarize it in that when excessive patenting on a single product exists, then participants in the innovation of that particular sector will impede each other from developing, assembling products that have a complex structure of patents that are owned by different universities. The patenting of research tools, again, if the emphasis of Bayh-Dole was to final products, the question is what happened when the patenting went up the stream of research into research tools. When scientists are starting to patent the research tools, then it impedes the flow and the share of information between researchers, because they now want to charge a licensing fee for the use of a scale, for the use of a new tool, for the use of assays and biomedical research, and that may slow down the advancement of science. So an unintended effect on, again, the efficiency of the innovation system may be that by crowding out basic research and by patenting research tools, innovation may actually be slowed at the head spring. Another set of effects discussed are on science and the university. There's a view that the ideal type of science, characterized by the sociologist Robert Merton, the values of universality and the community of researchers sharing information in the public domain, was undermined by this new regime because, as I was pointing out before, when researchers start being overly concerned about the commercial gain of their findings instead of putting them in the public domain, that exchange of information necessary for the advancement of science is interrupted. Critics have also observed that it may be changing the values at the university, right? Imagine in the university being a place where public disclosure of research is observed, where faculty define the research agendas, and when there is an impartiality in the assessment of research, that the new commercialization wave may undermine these values by increasing secrecy, by shifting the agenda of research into those by donor interests, and with conflicts of interest in particular. What has been missing of that debate has been the discussion of whether the Bayh-Dole Act has distributional consequences. What has been the distribution of the benefits of innovation in general, and how has that changed by the particular introduction of this policy regime of Bayh-Dole? So I'm pulling here a quote from Richard Levin, president of Yale, who said in 2011, speaking to the American Council of Education, referring to Bayh-Dole, Congress did not intend to give us the right to maximize profits. It gave us private property rights, speaking of the patents for universities, for a public purpose, to ensure that the benefits of research are widely shared. And I think he's going exactly to the point I'm making. Aside of concerns of efficiency and aside of concerns of organizational and cultural changes at the university level, very few people have asked whether the benefits deriving from Bayh-Dole are widely shared or not. And I think that's the missing point that I want to study, that I want to bring about, that I want to start to think into policy change with this value considered carefully. We started with a general discussion about the relationship between innovation and inequality, and I'd like to talk more specifically now about the distributional effects of technology transfer. And here's how I'm going to make the link. One, we see in general, this is a very general proposition, that systems reproduce asymmetries of inputs in outputs. There's a general tendency for systems to reproduce the distribution of their outputs. Second, I described creative destruction at the beginning and as a new cohort of firms replacing the old cohort by effect of innovation, right? So a key aspect in creative destruction to take place, in this dynamism of capitalism to take place, is that new companies, small businesses that emerge, mature on their own, come to stand on their own to promote, to establish a new order, the new economic order on the platform, or the new technological platform, right? There needs to be a cycle of maturation from small businesses to medium-sized large companies that phases out the old guard of firms for creative destruction to take place, right? And as I was describing, this is disruptive because reallocates the economies between the old sector and the new sector, and it's also politically disruptive. There was something on the sound cabin. Okay, industrial organization of high-tech sectors. One more key element in the nexus between innovation and distribution is innovation in a competitive sector will be substantially different than innovation in a monopolistic sector. Why? It is being, this has been widely studied and discussed, but to succinctly put, the motivations to innovate for a firm that operates in a competitive environment are to get an advantage over its competitors, right? So innovation pays a lot of attention on customer needs because they need to capture a larger market segment. In the case of a monopolist, he's not competing with anyone. So innovation is driven by increasing its long-term profits, but not with the concern with the concerns of the consumer in mind necessarily, right? A monopolist will not have the same drivers to innovate. Innovation can happen in a monopolistic market and a competitive market, but the incentives for these companies are different. And that is very important when you think of the distribution of innovation, because innovation, think of sectors like, every one of you is supposed to have a smartphone, right? The computing capacity of the smartphone that you have in your hands, of the smartphone that you use to update your friends about what you ate for breakfast and for lunch and for dinner, it is remarkable. The quality of those products has increased significantly year after year, and yet the prices don't seem to be increasing just as fast. Now, take the other sector, drugs or healthcare. Innovation has been also significant in the healthcare sector, and yet prices continue escalating, right? Think of the gains done in the design and safety of automobiles. The cars that we drive today are so much more safe than the drives that our parents drove, or our grandparents, right? I don't know how they got into those vehicles and survived. But the prices have not gone up as a proportion of our disposable income. It is remarkable how competition drives innovation, but with an eye on higher quality for the consumer and lower price. So more people, at lower prices, more people can access the benefits of innovation. It's very different than innovation in monopolistic sectors. So with that in mind, now let's see whether the system of the university system in terms of technology transfer has asymmetries, to start sniffing for a clue on asymmetric distributions in not only technology transfer, but in the innovation triggered by universities. Look what happened after Bayh-Dole was introduced, right here, in 1980. Universities started to open offices of technology transfer at an exponential rate, right? We have 218 Carnegie institutions that dedicated, or Carnegie classify institutions dedicated primarily to research. Almost all, if not all of the universities by the year 2006 had already established offices of technology transfer. The organizational capacity was quickly developed, right? It would seem that if you're thinking of replication of models, business models, units within businesses, that if a unit is quickly reproduced in a particular sector, it must be a great idea. It must be excellent for the bottom line, right? Customer service departments, for instance, how quickly they have been reproduced in time. So let's see whether this was such a great idea for the bottom line of universities. The distribution of licensing income of universities. I have used 3 measures, the last year, average last year, and average of the last decade. And what you can see is a highly asymmetric distribution, right? Only a few universities receive high income, and the majority of universities don't make a penny out of licensing. In despite of the fact that all universities have developed the organizational capacity for conducting technology transfer. So most universities have invested in this unit, significant amount of money. You need to pay attorneys to run these offices, and yet they're not getting much money out of it. 40 universities remain stable at the top of the list. The rest of universities are generally losing money. Now, when you run this comparison with research funds and licensing incomes, you find the same thing. Look first at the yellow line. That's research funds, right? It's highly asymmetric. That is, highly prestigious universities receive most of the research funds available for universities. But the licensing income is not only highly asymmetric too, but it's concentrated among the most prestigious universities, those universities that receive most of the research funding, right? It seems that in order to land a blockbuster patent, that's the language and the community of technology transfer to describe a very profitable patent. To land a blockbuster patent and make money out of it, it seems that you need to be playing in this exclusive club. When you do this with total federal research funds, is the same thing. You need to be in the exclusive club in order to get any money from technology transfer, in licensing fees, right? And in fact, out of the 218 universities dedicated to do research, intensely research, 132 operate at a loss. The exclusive club of 40 top earners remains stable year after year, with very, very small attrition. And input-output asymmetries are, in fact, suggestive by the fact that there's high asymmetries in the research funds, the way universities receive it, and, of course, in the licensing fees that they get. 132, imagine any sector with 132 firms losing money. I mean, you would imagine that many universities would stop dedicating efforts to licensing, right? But as I said at the beginning, there's an important role for the university in the innovation and economic development of the region. So universities cannot abandon their efforts, but of course the efforts that they need to change, or they have decided to change, is dedicating this model of simply getting fees from licensing. So why universities would stay in the technology transfer business? Not because of current observed losses, but because they expect at some point to land a blockbuster patent. That's one explanation. Because they have developed a capacity to train internally faculty and students about the benefits of being entrepreneurial, about the benefits of transferring research into commercial uses. Because they want to partner with the regions in the efforts for economic development. Because the universities have a public mission. And that means that certain activities will, of course, operate at a loss, at a commercial loss, if they have the promise to produce a benefit for the public. This is what I explained about the lottery of landing a blockbuster patent. I simply model using a profit model the technicalities of which are not necessary to discuss here. So if it's not a lottery, striking a blockbuster patent, what can universities do? One is to rebalance the research portfolio, to redirect the research portfolio to areas in which licensing is highly profitable. They can cultivate the entrepreneurial spirit in campus. They can introduce organizational incentives. Most universities have introduced now patenting within the tenure review of their faculty to promote these activities. Also, they can adopt a new technology transfer business model. And this is exactly what we see emerging in the in the Office of Technology Transfer. And what is this new business model? One strand that we can identify is socially responsible licensing. Socially responsible licensing is an umbrella that incorporates a number of licensing formats and contracts where the university strategically manage a contract in order to provide services of a patent to jurisdictions where are in high need and have very low income. For instance, if a technology provides humanitarian assistance, then the contract may be designed such that the company that develops in the US enjoys exclusivity within the US and for the US market, but on the non-exclusive basis, the patent is given for the development in the area that needs this humanitarian help. Examples of this kind of models are in the University of Berkeley, for instance. And the other technology transfer model that is increasingly used is to nurture startups. Instead of trying to seek money from licensing contracts, now Offices of Technology Transfer are shifting into give this or license this for a nominal fee, but in exchange of equity in a startup company. So if the company has a success, if the company is capitalized by a venture capitalist, if it's sold and absorbed by a large firm, then at that moment the university can get some cash. But the important aspect of nurturing startups is that yes, they may be losing money on the licensing front, but now they can justify their activity because they are creating new economic activity, right? The university is actively participating in creating and bringing new companies into the marketplace. So now the university is not seen as inimical to businesses by charging high fees, high licensing fees. Now the university is partnering with the business sector, creating or helping create new companies, right? Participating of entrepreneurial initiatives of the states. So it is indeed a very good idea. But let's examine now from this particular angle that I have said, the distributional consequences of technology transfer. What may be the consequence of the nurturing startups, as I called it, becoming a new standard for technology transfer in the university system? The pros is easier than selling licenses, of course. You don't have to sell it, you just give it to the new startup from the company. There's a higher deferred income, of course. If a startup becomes a successful company, then the university will see some profit from its equity, and it increases the prestige of the university, right? As I was saying, instead of being perceived as inimical to businesses, it seems pro-business for the region where it operates. The cons of the model is it's hard to sell lackluster startups, of course. Any venture capitalist will tell you how difficult it is to succeed in the majority of a portfolio of startups. There's only one or two in a portfolio of 100 that are really going to make it. So the university is risking here a very early negative cash flow, right? Disseminating or diversifying its portfolio of investments, but a lot of those investments are not going to be returned. And finally, the university is going out of traditional roles, right? In this model, increasingly the university operates and looks more like a venture capitalist, right? So there may be a risk to its prestige. What do we see is that by looking at venture capital, firms that have received this an early firms that have a success in receiving funding from venture capitalists tend to do it earlier than later. And second, firms may become impatient in receiving capital inflows as they try to find their own models being commercially successful. In the development of drugs, there's this thing called the valley of death. Between the first capital injection, which is generally called angel capital, it's small injections of capital from private donors invested in a company, to the either a venture capital injection of money or an IPO. There's a period in which a company that's developing a drug needs to make heavy expenses of in clinical trials, and yet may not have the liquidity to go through those heavy expenses. This value of that may then bring the untimely death of the company if it doesn't find sufficient cash to survive through the valley of death. So a company going through the valley of death may become very impatient, and if it receives a quick offer, even though it may have on its own become a successful company, may immediately accept the capital inflow and sell to one of the incumbents in the sector, which means that this needs for liquidity, the impatience that new startups may experience would limit their ability to grow on their own and stand as new players in the market on their own, but rather leads them to be absorbed by incumbent players. And you can imagine how in a sector in which incumbents have the power to absorb new companies, there is no creative destruction happening, right? It is the same old companies, the same large big players that consolidate the position by effect of this creative innovation taking place at small startups. Looking at history, this is exactly what happened with biotechnology. Biotechnology was almost a sector emanating from university research. And at first, in the early 90s, there was at least 100 promising startups. Some people even anticipated the end of the restricted monopolistic market of, as an oligopolistic market of pharmaceutical firms, because there were so many new firms with the promise and potential to develop the new generation of drugs. As of today, there are no big biotechnology startups standing on their own. They have all been absorbed by the 6 largest players in the pharmaceutical sector. Right? It seems that the historical evidence, at least of this sector, suggests that a liquidity need of firms, the impatience that may be driven by that need, then forces them into being absorbed, accepting takeovers from accepting the bids to be absorbed by larger companies. So we could see that there is a danger that creative destruction that we described as a mechanism for the market itself to create a distributional process doesn't come to fruition. So, as I was describing, there are certain sectors that where innovation takes place driven by competition, and certain others where it's driven by profits, not by the interest of or the higher quality for consumers. We may see that startups could eventually fall under that game, but that's not necessarily true. There could be sectors, or there are sectors of startups that produce that creative destruction that come to stand on their own. The question is, can the university have a role in promoting that market organization? Can the university have a role via their technology transfer activities to promote competition in sectors, and therefore to create more or an innovation that is more widely distributed? Well, the question remains open, but one would imagine that there are, if universities are committed to the public interest, the first role of them would be to, if they have a choice, to contribute to a design of an innovation, of a mode of innovation that promotes competition, universities would have to take that route. But universities cannot do it alone, and again, it's only a contribution that they could do from the technology transfer area. There needs to be an ecosystem of innovation governed by rules at all levels that help the university promoting competition in high-tech sectors. And I will suggest a few in the last section of this lecture at three levels, for university, for federal agencies, and at the level of Congress. The first is universities could have or could make a better effort to justify their existence, not exclusively in economic terms, economic rationalizations. There are many services that universities provide to society that are not merely economic. And I think universities have embraced too quickly a form of discourse of economic rationalization, and that may be limiting to their own abilities. I mean, universities provide many more services to society than merely their economic impact. So I believe that universities do themselves a service if they start promoting their usefulness across multiple dimensions and not exclusively via economic impact. And of course, this is relevant to the discussion of the economic impact of universities with which we started, because we need to understand the specific tasks that the university takes in technology transfer with respect to this panoply of objectives that are not merely economic. In other words, many of the activities that a university can take motivated by advancing other public values, not necessarily economic, have a relevance in the decisions that they can make on their technology transfer. Universities could adopt best practices. There has been 9 points to consider, a document issued by some universities that quickly the Association of University Technology Managers adopted as recommended best practices, including, of course, avoiding scenarios in which the university is perceived to be seeking exclusively profits. There is an emphasis on socially responsible licensing that universities can adopt, a preference for non-exclusive licenses whenever applicable, whenever possible. And in the particular case of nurturing startups, as I had discussed, because of this liquidity needs of the companies, adopt a longer time horizon for the investments of the university. In other words, help these startups not to become too impatient about liquidity injections, to allow them to reach a certain maturity and perhaps enter the markets where they are competing with incumbents as companies on their own and not be absorbed. At the agency level, some of the suggestions proposed is that research funding agencies could declare a preference for non-exclusive licenses from their grantees. This was originally introduced in the institutional patent agreement before Bayh-Dole became law, and Bayh-Dole was fashioned after these IPAs, but the language of a preference, of a government preference for non-exclusive license was completely dropped. So something that agencies could do without transgressing Bayh-Dole is declare a preference of the agency when they're giving grants. Another is to invite grantees to voluntarily opt out from aggressive licensing practices. This is a more technical discussion, but the point is that offices of technology transfer may see alternative reasons other than the specific clauses like reach through fees to be more flexible in the licensing contracts that they grant to licensees. Promote multi-site research grants. Funding agencies could invite individuals to or individual universities to bind together in research consortia and sponsor patent pools. And at the congressional level, reaffirm the role of the university as a broker agent of several constituencies. Not only industry and science. There's the student body. It is the other non-governmental organizations that benefit and from university research and university activity, and that these different constituencies create a difficult balancing game for universities, and that therefore the profit interest has to be balanced with the public interest when necessary in the writing of contracts of university patents when they are licensed, and create incentives for university cooperation, similar to the previous point on federal agencies that I suggest grants given to university consortia, and relax the exceptional circumstances. This is a technicality within the Bayh-Dole Act, and expand powers for marching rights, which is one of the safeguards introduced in the Act, where the agency can intervene if it sees that the needs of the public are not being served by a particular licensing contract. And with these policy recommendations, I will end my talk, and I'll be happy to take questions. One at a time, please. Yes.
Okay. Talk about creative destruction. In some contexts as being bad, some contexts as being good. But it sounds like for the consumer, creative destruction is really good because it creates a better price for the end product. Am I getting this right? Is that what you're saying?
You're getting it right.
Okay, so monopolistic approaches are probably not the way you want to go.
Well, there may be needs for monopolies to be preserved, precisely, for instance, when a startup company is trying to grow on its own. A startup company may benefit from a monopolistic position even when they don't have huge assets. It is the control of the intellectual property, intangible assets of the patent that would allow the company to grow. So it is not that all monopolies are an enemy of the consumer or of a widely distributed innovation system. It is the regulation of monopolies that do not enable federally funded innovation to be widely distributed. Yes?
What would you think about universities when they develop drugs and breakthroughs in those areas, when they license those drugs, actually license them at a zero licensing revenue, knowing how tough it is to get through the clinical trials, how much money it takes? Because there's such a disincentive right now to work with universities on their breakthroughs, because that's, there's no, drugs are it's such a long shot to get a drug through. I think universities might, right now I know UNLV's a little tight on their policies as far as their inventions in drugs and stuff like that.
Well, the first thing that I'm not sure is whether universities are giving royalty-free licenses to establish pharmaceutical companies, because pharmaceutical companies have the purse to pay hefty fees.
But the startups don't.
Yes, that's where universities may be given royalty-free licenses to small companies, particularly companies coming out from their own faculty members. So, for the university, it's not a heavy cost to allow the startup to have a nominal fee or a zero fee, in principle. Second, for the university is a cash investment to promote the nurturing of the startup. For instance, through an incubator. It needs to pay for the fees of the building, administrative support given to the startups in the building, if it's running laboratories for the startups, and all these things have heavy costs, right? So to return this cost, to justify this investment, the university need to take or should be allowed to take an equity interest in these companies.
Kind of a deferred one, yeah, absolutely.
The gamble is, and here's where the university starts entering into the territory of venture capitalists, is how far the university can take these efforts, how far to take the investment, and how according to this presentation, how to set up the whole system so that companies could have a longer time horizon to stand on their own to promote greater competition. So it's certainly a difficult balancing act to determine how far to push the university. I don't know if this answers your question or you want to do a follow-up.
That was the discussion. That's good. Yeah.
You guys are supposed to be asking questions.
You're pondering about all the material.
Well, you know, what's important in the university getting into the innovation business is actually create jobs for a lot of the students. That's where a lot of these future jobs are going to come from. And you know, especially in the sciences and you know, at this university, you know, most of them actually had to leave because there's not enough scientific jobs here. And so by developing some of these offshoots of inventions from the professors, they can start hiring their grad students, their postdocs, all that stuff.
Right. Explaining this relationship is very complex. I don't know if you, there are several moving elements to it. I don't know if you want to perhaps give me an example that you have in mind to illustrate this point.
Professor Ernesto Abel Santos just has a C. diff, invention around C. diff. It inhibits the spores of C. diff from growing in the stomach, so you can prevent that from being a problem in hospitals and whatnot. And by the university,
That's C. difficile?
C. difficile, C, yes.
Okay.
So the university could nurture that going through to get that product, spin that company out with that product.
Indeed, but the first question is whether the university has the resources to do this nurturing, right? And in the particular case of UNLV,
Sure.
The size of the university also restricts the size of grants to which it can access. So perhaps you're connecting to one of my policy recommendations at the agency level. There may be a greater interest of the federal government to equate the conditions on states that are smaller, with the smaller universities, to allow them to earmark some of the funds for promoting entrepreneurship. For instance, SBIR or STTR monies.
Right.
That the professor developing this treatment for C. difficile may access through this particular vehicle of funds available to smaller universities instead of competing with a pool of all larger universities. But insofar as those mechanisms, well, the NSF has one called EPSCoR. But insofar as those mechanisms are not in effect for most agencies and for most lines of funding, an alternative is also included in my recommendations for smaller universities to see increasingly partnership with larger universities, leveraging their own competitive advantages, sometimes the geography, sometimes a particular department, a particular industrial tradition within the state may benefit a research consortium of larger universities, so that these universities can have a better access to a patent portfolio that would help startups from the small company benefit from a larger research capacity. Perhaps those two ideas would come up first in my list of things that could possibly be worked on.
Yeah, no, agree.
Okay, I think this is it. But I'm going to stay back a couple of minutes in case anybody wants to ask questions personally. Thank you for coming.